of lectures in the series. I hope all of you have picked up a program to outline our series of lectures. Today we're talking on the area of agriculture and food. There's an evening lecture this evening by Dr. Sylvain Witwer from Michigan State University, and that will be at 8 o'clock, and it will be on food research and technology needs for the 21st century. Today we're very privileged to have our speaker, who happens to be on the faculty here at Iowa State University, but many of you probably have not had a class with him, and that's for the benefit of those students who haven't had our speaker. A real privilege for him to come here and speak today. In just a short hour and a half, I think you'll begin to see why, while he was on campus a few years back, he had a large group of students who were very interested in what he had to say and how he addressed issues relating to agriculture, development, and economics. Our speaker is Richard Weisskopf. He's a graduate of Harvard University with a BA and PhD in economics. His first teaching assignment was at Yale University, where he was an assistant professor. Then in 1974, he joined the faculty of Iowa State University as an associate professor. He also has taught in Peru and in the University of Havana at Cuba. He has traveled, too, extensively in third world countries. He traveled to South America and the Caribbean. He's traveled in China and India. He also, while he was here in Ames, in addition to his teaching and research activities, participated in community affairs. He sponsored a series of lectures called the Ames Connection and followed that up with a study group with the same title, the Ames Connection, focusing on the connection between the community of Ames and international countries and communities around the world to find the connections. 2 years ago, he briefly went to Puerto Rico to complete a book on Puerto Rico, and he stayed there as a visiting professor at the University of Puerto Rico, and also did some labor work. He worked as an agricultural laborer on the coffee and orange fields. He's currently on leave from Iowa State, and he's presently working in Washington, D.C. with the Food and Nutrition Service of the U.S. Department of Agriculture. And he's also in the process of completing that book on Puerto Rico. So I'm very pleased to introduce a friend and former professor, Dr. Richard Weisskopf.
Well, it's a pleasure to be here. I had this experience I have to relate to you. Yesterday I was putting together some materials, and I found in a Washington bookstore a new journal called Counterspy. I bought the last few issues. It's put out by a number of ex-CIA operatives who have gone straight or gone honest. I don't know how you say it. And I was reading it on the plane, and then we got off the plane, and Jim Dubert was there. And he picked me up in the Des Moines airport, and we're driving towards Ames. All of a sudden, the car goes off the road. It starts sliding and crosses the divide. It crosses the divide, and then it ends up going the other way. You know, you and I have been hearing for years about CIA exploits, and I had the feeling that somebody was doing something to the road between Ames and Des Moines, that I had something really important I wanted to tell you today, and that the forces of nature were trying to intervene to prevent this lecture. So here we are. The rest of the story is that we're going the wrong way. We're going, after making this U-turn by the force of an act of God, going south, right? We fall off the other side, almost into a ditch, and a truck comes along and stops. He's going to help us, but he can't stop because it's ice, and he slams into us and pushes us even further into the ditch. And then he's in the ditch. And then a wrecker comes, and he gets stuck also, trying to pull out the truck that tried to pull out the car. Well, in the end, the second truck did get out, the injured truck. Our car was smashed, and we just left it there. And we went back to the a hospitality house of the Catholic Workers' House in Des Moines, stayed there overnight. I prayed and got up the next day, and sure enough, we got here without any problem. So that's by way of introduction. This is a multimedia show in many ways. There's 3 blackboards, 4 slide projectors, and it's hard to summarize one's life, in an hour. But what I'd like to do is leave you with some of the ideas and guides that I have found in the last few years about how to understand some of the problems of agricultural development and underdevelopment. And part of the confusion, I think, is because the vocabulary doesn't help us to understand the problem. So what I'd like to focus on today are 2 halves of the problem. One are the words that will give us the power to understand the situation, to grapple with them, and to make them, to allow us to make head or tail of the confusion, the apparent confusion in the world. The second half, I'd like to show you some pictures. Now, the question is imagine if I were in the East showing slides of Iowa, 1 slide at a time. There's no way that people not from this area could understand it. And so what I'm going to try to do is show 4 at once, so you get a feeling of how it is to be in some of these places, and also to make some connections between unlike places. So it's both a travel log, and it's also well, you'll see. You'll see. Because with 4 projectors, we could mess up things. We could put side-by-side things so that you can experience some of the things that I've had to grapple with. It's easier to walk around with one eye closed. When you open both eyes and you see it all right in front of you, then it becomes more problematic, more puzzling. And I'd like to share that puzzlement with you. I want to give you some literature first about the kinds of things that I'm going to put together. The first, of course, is Counter-Spy. On sale in your local. It's a very interesting journal. It's just begun to come out, and it puts together the stories that don't make sense in the press. It shows where they came from, what the origin is, and begins to help make connections. A second source is Farming for Profit in a Hungry World by Michael Perlman, a colleague of mine from Chico State, graduate of Berkeley in agricultural economics. And there he sort of lays out a lot of the things that Counter-Spy lays out, but from an academic, intellectual point of view. And then, as a faithful employee of the United States Department of Agriculture, I have been subscribing to a number of publications about U.S. statistics, where foods come from, that come into the United States, where our foods and agricultural products go. And there's a whole series of agricultural situations, U.S. foreign agriculture, put out by the Foreign Agricultural Service, which is really a reporting service to help the farmer, or to help, I'm not sure who he's helping. I'm not sure, but they put out a lot of publications. And they're almost monthly in the sense of telling us what the grain harvest is like in the Soviet Union, what the cotton harvest is like all over the world, what the soybean situation is all over the world, so that we know our competitive position, but also lays out in front of us at our fingertips how the entire world begins to form together. There are a number of popular publications that I found enormously helpful. Well, from the Institute for Food and Development Policy, and by the author of Food First and Diet for a Small Planet, come 2 new publications about world hunger, 10 myths, and a resource guide that are very simply written, very well written, and I found them just marvelous source books to laying out some of the mysteries. Well, the mysteries we have to answering some of the mysteries. And last is, and this is what I'd like to start with. Oh yeah, there are 2 more. One is Amnesty International. I found out about Amnesty International at Iowa State, where I have to tell you this brief story. When we were writing letters to help free political prisoners, and in walked a man, a Chilean, who said in halting English, he said, "I am here in Iowa because people here wrote letters," that he was a political prisoner that was released. And since then, I've been following Amnesty International's publications and making the comparison between where the different prisoners are held and what their agricultural situation is like. That's the connection I want to help draw tonight, too, this afternoon. Well, there are various other publications about hunger and food policy notes from different Washington lobbying groups. And last is the address to the Board of Governors by Robert McNamara. He's the president of the World Bank. Used to be the chief planner for General Motors. Used to be the Secretary of Defense during a very important period in American history. So the man who brought you the Vietnamese War is now saving the third world, if you could believe that. To reduce and eliminate massive absolute poverty lies at the very core of development itself. I could just hear McNamara saying this stuff. It is critical to the survival of any decent society. He's talking about himself in Washington. By the way, Washington is a wonderful place. I mean, you walk around and all you see is marble and concrete and a subway system that goes nowhere, but it must have cost the American taxpayer hundreds of millions of dollars. It's like a monument city. It's a city of monuments. McNamara continues. Development is clearly not simply economic progress measured in terms of gross national product. It's something much more basic. It is essentially human development. It is an open insult to the human dignity of us all to have poverty in the world. So sustaining the attack on poverty is not an economic luxury. It's precisely the opposite. It is the moral responsibility and an economic imperative. And in the rest of his address is I'll tell you how I will lend the next $10 billion to these countries so that they can continue to do whatever they're doing. It doesn't quite say what. I thought $10 billion, we make a lot of the World Bank. The agency I work for, Food and Nutrition Service, distributes about $15 billion a year to America. That's called the Food Stamp Program and other nutritional programs. So McNamara has a very important position, but it's really peanuts in terms of the resources of our great country. Now the vocabulary. And this is I feel like I have 5 hours. I mean, I haven't been on campus in 3 years. And it's like I'd like to tell you all the things that I've missed telling you in the last 3 years. And I will. But, okay, does anyone have a watch? Could you tell me when a half hour is up? Just say half hour, and then we'll move on to the slides, because I don't want to keep everybody for the next 5 hours. The vocabulary, can I leave these alone? Are these going to be all right? The vocabulary of agricultural modernization and underdevelopment. The thing that I have found confusing is that there's like two faces to the same thing. And the two faces are expressed in language. And the only way I think we can get a hold on that, the one reality, is to learn the two languages and translate between them. The first is the vocabulary that I learned, that I studied, that I suffered for. And that's called modernization, or economic growth. I used to teach this. And I still do. And that's on the left side. And the other set of theories that have been much more advanced in Africa and in South America and in Europe, and only in certain universities in the United States, is called the theory of underdevelopment. And it talks about the same phenomena, but it uses different words and looks at it more broadly. Let me go over the conventional theory, which you all have heard, might have heard it last night, you might hear it tonight, and if you take any courses, you'll hear it, because this is the conventional wisdom as it's taught to us. The countries are called poor countries. They're backward countries, or they're poverty-stricken. Those are the words that are used. The preoccupation is with economic growth. And then there's a preoccupation with their population. So economic growth is measured in income or output. That's what they talk about, output. When they worry about population, then they talk about output per capita. Right? They're worried about what's the value of these people's material possessions. Then they talk about technology. These people are farming using medieval techniques. They're backward people. They haven't modernized. Right? The technology is not productive. The resources are poor. They don't use the best lands. They don't know how to mix the different kinds of resources. And therefore we prescribe, when we worry about output per capita, we prescribe a new technology. That new technology which has worked so well in this country should work in other countries. If it's worked here, the double productivity or triple productivity, why not in these other countries that are suffering from backwardness? And therefore we prescribe hybrid seeds, new pesticides, new machines. They need more water because the seeds don't work without, they need more water than currently available. So therefore, we have to design irrigation projects, reclamation to increase the amount of land. We'll drain the swamps. They need more water. We can build dams, or we could build tube wells, bringing up water from the ground. So that's in red are the prescriptions and the preoccupations. Some of the words, the key words, the buzzwords that economists learn are things like this. And you can take a whole course in the following word: comparative advantage. There's a whole course on international trade. They work it out in diagrams and numbers. Comparative advantage. You specialize in sugarcane, and we'll specialize in soybeans and machinery. You specialize in cotton. We'll specialize in textiles and machinery and pesticides and everything else. And that's comparative advantage and specialization. You stay in the kitchen, and I'll do everything else. That's another form of specialization. Or you do the laundry, and you do the cooking, and I'll go to work, and I'll use the living room and all the other rooms of the house. The balance of payments, another key word. You must do this because your balance of payments is negative, they say, or it's imbalanced. Balance of payments says that you're importing more than you're exporting, therefore you should specialize, therefore you should go into that area in which you have a comparative advantage. Stay in one area. They tell me, you should be a professor. So I've only been a professor, and then I realized the real joy of living is not being a professor, but in being a total human being. And that's what we've been telling the third world, is you should specialize in one or two crops: cocoa, coffee, sugarcane, cotton. But don't worry about food. We'll supply you with food, because you can't eat cotton, and you can't eat too much sugarcane. Export agricultural minerals. That's the other prescription to the third world. You export your agricultural products. Like, we don't grow bananas, we don't grow coffee or cocoa. So you should grow that and export it to us, and then we will export to you something in return. And then if they don't have agricultural land, but something we need more valuable, copper, bauxite, oil, then don't worry about agriculture. We will export food to you. You export oil to us, or uranium or whatever. They talk about one world, a very noble gesture. They talk about the haves and the have-nots, the rich and the poor. That's the notion of one world in the conventional vocabulary. The other vocabulary, and I know when I was here, we didn't really talk about this very much. We didn't really talk, and I, as a professor, I really feel somewhat guilty, but I was ignorant, and I tried. So now let me try to correct the other side of the story. The other side of the story is talking about what's called the theory of underdevelopment. The theory of underdevelopment talks about relationships between human beings. It doesn't talk about these things on the left. Relationships between human beings is summarized in one word, in the blue, the mode of production. How do people make a living? What's their relationships with each other? That comes first. Are they wage employees? Are they slaves? Are they landlords and servants? Are they kind of a feudal relationship? Well, the current mode of production is called the capitalist mode of production. That word doesn't appear in my textbooks. It never did. I didn't know I was living in a capitalist society until I was 35. And it's okay, I think. It's okay to talk about the capitalist mode of production, because it's a dominant mode of production. It's the mode of production that really, it's like that famous, the sign for Dutch boy paints, is a globe, and you see someone pouring paint over it. The capitalist mode of production is that which is covering the world with certain major exceptions. And even those are in question. Well, it came in contact with another mode of production, which we're interested in, the pre-capitalist. That is, what was there in South America before today? How did the Incas run their society, or the Aztecs? What was in Africa before Europe dominated? What was in America when the Indians controlled the countryside? That is, what was their mode of production? Well, the point is that that's history. We live under the capitalist mode of production. And there are three key words that I want to leave you with here. One is commodities. The notion of that under capitalism, we produce things for sale. So I wrote for sale and for use. Unlike producing something for your own use that you didn't sell, today most of the world that we know produces things to be sold, and then they buy what they need. Those things for sale have to be useful too. That's what a commodity is. It's very simple. And most everything is a commodity today. In Washington, at 11 o'clock, 12 o'clock, 1 o'clock at night, you walk around the streets. I wouldn't. In certain parts, you don't walk. And you see people selling themselves as commodities. I mean, there is no service or thing that cannot be sold in this world. Everything has a price, including our souls or our professional ability or love or whatever. That's under capitalism. That's not true of all societies, and it need not be true forever. That's the notion of a commodity. The world market, that is, things that are produced here end up on the other side of the world. It's a world market that ties different parts of the globe together. That's the true meaning of one world. That's the true meaning of one world. It's the world market. Things from South Africa that reach here, things from Australia, things from Iowa that reach out all over the world. It's one world market. And the motive for all this is summarized in the word profit. Now, we don't produce soybeans because we're philanthropists, because we love the soil. We produce it for a profit. Otherwise, we'll be run under. We'll be plowed under. We produce arms, and we sell them for a profit. We produce, you name it, and you sell it for a profit. Now, there are some places, I visited the Mennonite Council in Washington. There are, as I understand it, some people that don't farm for profit. But that's a very small part of America. And I'm not saying profit is bad. I'm just saying that it's a characteristic of the capitalist mode of production. The second major area that people don't talk about in economics is history. The history of how what is today came to be. You see, on the left side, on all the theory of modernization and of backwardness, they never talk about history. How India got to be poor. How China got to be liberated. They really don't like history. Now, economists are pretty dense. They can't understand history. But I think to be fair, because I know some economists that like history, it's because their theory is non-historical. It doesn't say, in other words, when I was born, history began. That's the way economists look at the world. I mean, that's really egocentric, right? That is, when someone walks into India and looks around at the poverty and the agriculture, and they say, well, there was nothing here before I stepped on this continent. That's what I mean by ahistorical. That is, they don't look into the roots. How was that society before the British arrived? How did hundreds of millions of people feed themselves? What did the British do when they arrived? And we call that colonialism. That's not a bad word in America because America doesn't have colonies. The British had colonies and the French have colonies and the Russians have colonies and the Germans had colonies, but America doesn't have colonies. So we could use that word in a somewhat objective way. Of course we have colonies, but we'll get to that in a minute. What I'm interested in history, what history has to tell us is about the destruction of let's see, well, history is made by people, yet it is above people. By that I mean it's like building a little dam in the middle of a big river. When you try to press against history, and you realize that as individuals, we don't have much power. But a lot of people can change the course of rivers. They could channel rivers and change them. In that way, history is a product of the collective human experience. And yet as individuals, we feel powerless in front of history. No, we're just students or professors or people making our lives. But history is important to answer and to understand why countries are poor or why they're agriculturally underdeveloped. Now, the key to history, I think, is not the repetition of princes and kings, but it's the destruction of the pre-capitalist relations. In other words, what was in India before? How did it change? It is the destruction or the change in that society, such that it is today. That's what history has to offer us. For each area we're worried about, Latin America, Africa, the United States, this part of the United States. And then there are three other words. This is too low. I've lifted up. I'll say them out loud. One is social class. Economists never talk about social class. It's not nice. You can't talk about the exploiting class or the upper class or the wealthy or whatever. But I think as an economist, And as people interested in underdevelopment, we have to talk about who the rich are and who the poor are and how they got that way. So social class is a basic tool of analysis for economics and history and sociology and anthropology. And it's left out of the books. The second is the state. We call that the government. Now, a lot of the current economic ideology in America is to make the government disappear, to wish it away. But it's really called the state. And the state intervenes in everything. I mean, it's the state university. The state is here, and it's even more prevalent in other countries. In economics, we never study the state. We study economic theory. We never study government. It's a whole other department. Right? You have to get a PhD in that, before you can study that. And that's wrong. The state is a real concept, just like social class is a real concept that is useful to us in understanding the world. The third is corporations. You can't talk about poverty or the third world without talking about corporations. You can't talk about America without talking about corporations. And that's not talked about in economic theory. It does not exist. There are producers and there are consumers, but there's no corporations. Well, there's no producers that aren't corporations. Corporations live longer than I live, and you live, so there's something special about corporations. And I think we should learn about them. We should have a course on corporations, and should be required, everybody, because they are an important instrument in our lives and in this world. Now, there's two visions of the world. I spoke of one world of the haves and have-nots. That's in the old vocabulary of modernization. In the vocabulary of underdevelopment, there is also one world, but it's one world of equals that has to be made. And that's why this theory is useful for a different purpose. The idea of this theory is to understand the world in order to make one world of equals and end those aspects of this world that we're unhappy with, or we think are undignified, as McNamara said. Right, that's this blackboard. Now, I wanted to turn your attention. Can you folks see this blackboard more or less? It's just a quick scheme. How are we doing on time? 2 minutes. Okay. I want to talk about cotton in Nicaragua and another concept. Nicaragua, we'll see some slides about Nicaragua, was told to specialize in cotton. It had excellent land and excellent rainfall, and the only thing they needed, they needed a labor force, and they needed technology, so they imported pesticides and fertilizers and implements and harvesters. The harvesters, by the way, were made in Ankeny, and I'll show you some pictures of them. In fact, I went to visit them. That's the connection. That's the Ankeny connection. Now, so this is in the developing countryside as land, labor, technology, and the government, or the state. And the idea was to grow cotton and export it, where it would be purchased in the USA for its mills. Okay? But there's some other tricks in this business. This is agricultural development. One is that they have to buy all this stuff. That is, the United States exports the inputs. Got it? Pesticides, fertilizers, implements come from the United States. Ankeny sends in the harvest. Now, what happened to our cotton pickers in the United States? Well, they came from the Delta. That migration began at the end of World War II. They started moving up as the cotton picker made and designed, invented in the Midwest, invaded that country, that countryside. The people were liberated, productivity rose, profits rose, and the cities of the North were filled with black people. But that's the connection. Okay, between Harlem, the Delta, cotton pickers, and the unemployed. That's how we get to America today, with high unemployment, especially in the cities. The other connection is between absentee owners. Who owns the land? Well, a lot of the owners are in the United States. That's the classic case of the country in which either the upper class in the third world country lives in the United States, or the corporation buys up a lot of land. Then there's the government. The government has a problem, because before the people used to grow their own corn and their own beans, and now it's converted to cotton land. So where do they get the food to feed the cotton workers? Well, they have to buy it. So they turn to the United States, and the government then imports wheat and sends it, gives it to their people. Of course, it's paying out the profits that it's making on the cotton. It's got another problem. It's got a lot of unemployed people. Well, there's two ways to deal with the unemployed. You give them food stamps, but in many countries they haven't arrived there yet. They import arms. And so the two major exports of our country are arms and food. Very strange combination. So their government imports both arms and wheat and uses them for their people, to keep their people in line, to feed those people that are working and those people that are lifting up their voices too loudly or repressed. Those arms aren't used to defend the national borders entirely. They're used against their own people. I understand that Des Moines has an armory. Is that right? Is there an armory in Des Moines? Anybody know? It's downtown, isn't it? It's not on the frontier. I was in Boston yesterday. I'm driving in downtown Boston, and there's this fortress. And they said, this is the armory. I said, why is it there? They said, well, probably from the Indian days. I said, well, the Indians were on the outskirts of Boston. They weren't downtown Boston. The person started thinking, and they said, it was built in the Depression. Why was it built? Well, because there were a lot of bread lines and a lot of people very angry. The armory, the National Guard, and they're built in the middle of cities to protect, I'm not sure who they protect property classes against the riffraff. Probably you or my father's. Grandfather's, whatever. Okay, now the one connection between these two halves is something I've written here, price. Now the notion that I was brought up on is that price is the thing when you go to a supermarket, there's a price on top of each item. Or sometimes it's coded and then you take it through the line and it goes and you find out the price. Between each transaction there's a price. When you export these items, there's a price. The idea that price is negotiated. And that negotiation is one of power. It's one of force. It's not two brothers coming together and saying, hey, I like you, brother. Here's some tractors for some cotton. It's, what's the price? And they hammer it out. When there's a difference over that price, like what is the price of my labor worth to you, we have a strike. So people in this community have experienced that kind of scene. The last time I was in Des Moines, I went to jail on a strike. And it occurred to me that this concept of price isn't something that, as I studied, is an objective idea of value. That is, you add up your costs and you get a value, and that's the price. Price is the result of class conflict. Price is the result of class conflict, or between